There's quite a few phrases in the English language that have the word mouth in it. And they can range from good things to embarrassing things. And I would like to share a few examples with you. In the clinical world, we have dry mouth, which means no saliva. In the sports world, we have smash mouth, which means to play aggressive. And in the social world, we have poor mouth, which usually means that you're crying about your poverty, but you might really have a stash of money stuck away somewhere. And we can't forget about the phrase potty mouth, which means to bring out a vulgar word every once in a while, just to make our conversation more colorful, to spice things up. Well, to that category, I would ask if I can introduce one more phrase that has the word mouth in it, and that phrase that I'm selecting this morning is cheap mouth. And I would define cheap mouth as meaning talking into the air, or just saying things that don't have the muscle behind it, that don't have the intent, that we're exaggerating or promoting something that really isn't justified. That's what I call cheap mouth. Kind of like under the talk is cheap category. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, we're sitting here in this esteemed institution here, and we don't have to worry about things like that. But I am up here to tell you this morning that, unfortunately, we do. That we all suffer bouts of cheap mouth from time to time. And Christians, especially, need to watch themselves, knowing that we are being scrutinized so much by the outside world that people are looking very closely to see if we do what we say and say what we do. And the genesis of this sermon started a couple weeks ago when we had a soul shop. We took the book of James and we had a readathon. And the book of James is in the back of the New Testament. It's very short. It's only about 5 chapters long. And it's purported to be written by the younger brother of Jesus. At least that's what tradition tells us. And it's filled with a lot of good advice. It's not really written to any specific person, but it's just like a list of general instructions. And I like James because he doesn't mince words, he doesn't beat around the bush, he doesn't go on for page after page after page. He just says what he wants to say and then gets out. And one of the first things that James says is, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but you don't have works? Can faith save you? And that's such a good question. And it's one of the main questions that we as human beings are always thinking about. What is going to save us? How do I get to heaven? Sure, I come to Jesus Christ, but in what manner? How do I do it? And it's always this question between faith and works. And we touched upon it last week in my sermon about Nicodemus. When Nicodemus came to Jesus, and here we have James is wrestling with the same thing in his book, in the Bible. And on one hand, people say, well, you have to work for it. You know, you have to do good deeds. It doesn't matter what you believe. You just have to work, and you have to work, and you work. But of course, the downfall with that is, how do you know what is enough? If God requires 1,000 good works and you come in at the end of your life with only 998, you kind of fall short. And then we have the faith group. That's the other group, where people will say, have faith. Have faith, and then you're good to go. It doesn't matter what else you do. And the downfall of that, of course, is you can be a perfect lady or gentleman here at church, professing with your lips Jesus Christ, but then go out later in the day and do something horrific. Do something that God is sure to disagree with. And do you realize that in the Reformed Church, that we discourage something called altar calls? Have you ever even heard of this? That is when, at the end of every service, the minister will ask people if in their heart do they feel moved, do they want to give themselves over to Christ, can they come right up here and profess it now? And a lot of churches do that. And the RCA has a good reason for not encouraging that, because we feel that our faith is not an instant conversion, that it's a long time, gradual thing, that we build our mountains one day at a time, rather than just going off like a light bulb and quickly saying, I'm a Christian, but then maybe not following through. And of course, we think of the Billy Graham crusades, at the thousands of people who made the trip up to the front. And that touches my heart. And don't get me wrong, I really love to see that. But it just makes you wonder how many of those people are really going to follow through and live a life rich with faith, knowing how extreme some people's religious conversions can be. And it's like you have to have a plan. You have to know where you're going with this once you profess your Christianity. It's like when I was 17, most people here know that I hitchhiked from New Jersey to California, and my friend and I were very good at the initial planning stages of knowing what to bring and where to go and how to deal with the rigors of the road. And then we finally got to San Francisco, and it was the greatest day of our life. We loved it. We were jumping around, shouting for joy. But then we realized something. We didn't plan anything beyond that. There was no plan in place. So we both had our very best day and our worst day both on the same day, because we were joyful, but we had no other plan to go forward with. So I think that when the topic is religious conversions, it's best to think of it as a long-distance hike through the woods rather than a 100-yard dash to the finish line. And there have been some great conversions out there. I was reading about somebody named Melissa Miles, who is 46 years old, who was raised by atheist parents and was a war correspondent in Iraq. But one day she just felt something in her heart. And she felt that God was pulling her into church. And after a long struggle that took several years, she finally gave herself over to Christianity. And she eventually started a food bank in her town with the quote, "Doing the gospel rather than just quoting it was the best way I could find out what God was up to." And another nice religious conversion that I read about was a person who was born a Muslim named Kamal Salim, who remembers that God spoke to him very directly in the early days of his conversion. And he remembers God telling him, "You are my warrior. You are not their warrior." And as he fell down to his knees, he said, "Oh, my Lord, I will fight and I will die for you." And he says very clearly, he remembers hearing God responding to that, saying, "No, you don't have to die for me, Just go out there and work for me. So again, we have both sides of the aisle in this battle between faith and works. And getting back to the scripture in James, he says, faith without works is dead. And now we know he has faith, but he says you have to have works there, so he gives us a formula. And the formula is very simple, that both of these elements have to work hand in hand. He gives us an analogy of that. He says, just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. And I kind of see a mathematical equation here. I'm not that great at math, but I see faith as the numerator of the equation with the line drawn, and it's divided by works. Faith over works. And so I think the correct way to interpret James is that, yes, we start with faith, but we need to support it by what we do, what we believe, what we say, how we go about our business. And it leads to this theological term called justification. That's kind of like what happens after salvation. Justification means that when a person accepts the gift of salvation, when we're made acceptable in God's sight, that God declares us righteous. So that's where we want to be. We want to be justified. But if we're righteous, that means that we just can't sit at home with a bottle in one hand and a cigar in another, doing whatever we please. It means that we need to work on behalf of God and to serve God. That we can't go around and having cheap mouth. And I love James's plain talk on the situation. He says at the beginning of the scripture which Ryan read, he said, what good is it if a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, but you don't supply them with their bodily needs? And how often have I faced that when I see the homeless in New York City? And they're there. They have swollen feet. That's the way you can tell a homeless person. Their clothes are in tatters. They haven't had a bath in weeks. They smell bad. And what kind of a Christian would I or any other person be if we just went up and shook their hand? Oh, hello, sir. Have a good day. I really hope that you can find some food and some shelter today and that you're going to live a good life. No. You have to be Jesus in that situation. You have to give the food. You have to provide what they need right on the spot. You have to give them money. Because to just talk like that is cheap mouth. You have to do something to be righteous in God's eyes. And cheap mouth is very close to the phrase, loose lips sink ships. And right in James, he says, look at ships. Though they are so large, it takes strong winds to drive them. Yet they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of that points or directs. And he's talking about taming the mouth and keeping ourselves under control, because a ship on the ocean can be foiled by just one little bad turn by the one person who's at the rudder. And he gives another good analogy about forest fires, saying that a great fire can rage, but just takes one match in the wrong place at the wrong time to start it. And he talks about how faith is brought to completion by works. He talks about Abraham willing to sacrifice his son. A good combination of faith and works. How he was willing to actually do that. And he was doing that with faith until God called it off, as God shielding the Israeli spies and by helping them. It all comes down to how actions speak louder than words. And how about Jesus? Let's bring this to a close by talking with Jesus. If anybody did not have cheap mouth, it was Jesus. He lived the way that he spoke, and vice versa. He practiced what he preached. He said in John 15, "Greater love has no one than the person who lays down his life for their brother or sister." And did he or did he not fulfill that? And he says in another part of the gospel, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." And did he not live that out? And author Russell Stewart writes, Jesus never owned a home or had any possessions. He traveled through the surrounding area with his disciples, sleeping under the stars. They were supported by contributions, and though they always had enough, they were not wealthy. He lived an ordinary life, just like everybody else, humbling himself even to the point of living like a servant. So, as I close this morning, that is what I would like to leave you with, that our mouths are such a great gift, that they have such power, and they have the ability to both bring joy or to destroy. So we must be careful not to suffer from cheap mouths.